the stakeholder group, is that a particular area that you would be making outreach efforts to?
Well, we have included those types of groups in our initial contacts. They're still on mailing lists. They have not been to meetings particularly. As we get into more detail, yes, we have talked at the steering committee level. As we get to actual, probably not so much at the governance structure level where we are right now, but we're going to have certainly technical advisory committees and reviews of what we're doing that should be encompassing those groups. And ultimately, there may be a place at the table. At this point, the group did decide, again, it is a stakeholder decision for a stakeholder group, that the actual steering committee would be people who are either with money or in-kind services actually paying for the program. And at this point, no environmental group or EJ group has stepped up with a checkbook, which is not surprising. It's a significant issue for this program. It's a significant issue for all of our TMDLs or any planning or even permitting efforts, how to get out and reach these communities. So it is definitely on our plate. Our board member, Bob Schneider, will definitely make sure it's on our plate, because when we get to some of these actions we're talking about modifying monitoring programs, those have to be done through permit amendments through a public hearing process. We will be asked that question again by our board, and we are proceeding along the lines of keeping the various groups informed. And when we get to actual decision making, that will be the time we will have a more focused outreach.
And if I recall correctly, it was either at that regional board meeting or another meeting where there was also a discussion about building scientific and technical capacity, especially among the EJ groups. Does that ring a bell for you?
There has been, and I think it was probably more part of the Mercury TMDL discussions.
Probably.
Some discussion about partially the economic and just time constraints on these various groups to participate, but also how do they learn enough to participate in the process and not just show up at meetings, but that is one of the things. I believe you heard a briefing very recently on the I'm not getting the term exactly correct, the risk reduction element of the Delta Mercury program, of trying to get out into these communities, inform them of the issues, and that's a two-way street, letting them know about the issues of consuming fish that are contaminated with mercury, as well as get information back from them that we need in our future steps of working on the Mercury TMDL. So I think that's the venue that discussion came up, at least at Region 5.
Thanks.
I would encourage the group, the stakeholder group, to consider adding a space early for environmental justice folks. I know at SWRCB there has been an environmental spot, if you will, that has been quite useful, because sometimes environmental groups can and environmental justice groups can bring in additional funding for special projects through foundations, through other, through individuals who might be contributing even to their organizations. So, don't think of environmental organizations as being like dead weight in your group. You may have to consider who comes in, because I know, again, in Southern California, the main person who was involved was a scientist. He had a PhD scientist, had done a lot of work on POTW type wastewater issues, and so he was quite knowledgeable and able to to converse and participate. So, but it gives a stronger sense of consent, of a broader sense of support for your findings, for your assessments, and for, kind of even for the projects that you identify that you want to do. And so I really encourage you to think about that as you move forward.
It's good to see you all here. It's very important that this follows on to, our 6 days of hearing on the Bay Delta and the importance of coordinated science. And it's good to see Reiner here. He has a lot of relevant experience that I've worked with him closely in the San Francisco Bay region. And Ms. Dorn mentioned sort of the linkage to management decisions. And there is a clear linkage that needs to be part of this in terms of a commitment for all of us to link to the water quality assessments that we do and our impaired water bodies lists and just our management decisions on what are the priority pollutant reduction efforts, because we have limited resources. So when we look at things like cost neutrality, I respect it and everything, but there is a broader sense of what is the cost today in terms of information that we're basing a lot of management decisions on that might not be the highest priorities because we don't have a framework that's regional. So really cost neutrality is bigger than just what's my budget today for that kind of monitoring versus the future. There are other costs that we're incurring because of a lack of a coordinated structure that focuses how we spend funds. The added benefits of this informational context have borne fruit in a big way in the San Francisco Bay region. I know specific stories I can tell you, waste hours of your time about what we used to monitor for and what we used to think was a problem. And same with swamp. I was in the swamp roundtable when we started that program. This type of exercise is critical in terms of overall cost to all of you that are sitting here and other stakeholders that are represented by your important efforts. So this is going to bear fruit. Hang in there, stand by your guns in terms of unreasonable costs, but let's keep our minds open about what the benefits are in terms of focusing our management decisions and the costs that are entailed with those type of important decisions that are statewide in context. And with that, please continue this great progress, and thanks for the positive report.
That's great. I want to thank you, too. At the peril of coming between people and lunch, though, I do have a question. Sorry. No, I appreciate the process that it's taking, the time it's taking, and the trade-offs, the fears, the hopes, the dreams, all of that. I think, I don't mean to minimize it. It's all very true, and you're all very eloquent in it. It would be helpful for me, unless it's just too premature and you just consciously can't do it, if you could give me an example or two of the kinds of things that you think might make a difference, like what you would monitor for at a regional level as opposed to being in individual permits. I'd just love a concrete example, even if it's one that's controversial, of the actual stuff of what you're doing. And I will look at your pulse of the Delta reports, which I have not. Oh, that's even easier. Thank you. I was trying to see if I could do it while you were talking, but I can't do two things at once. So.
I don't want to speak to personally, I don't want to speak to a specific example, but I do want to mention the fact that our February 1st in our regional board, we did have Greg Erickson on the panel. He wasn't able to be here today. He sits as the chair of the IEP coordinators, and he spoke to the fact that they are all very interested and very aware and very willing to participate and make those adjustments and coordinate the monitoring between all of the very expensive and very detailed and very long-term data sets that they have established through IEP, and work in some of this more water quality and contaminants monitoring that would make all of that information much more useful, whether it's the pesticides or the nutrients or whatnot. So maybe somebody else wants to speak to a specific example, but
I knew I could count on you.
Yes.
Yeah, I just like you don't take a lot of time or his hours of stories, which I will gladly hear from him another time.
I'm brief.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Yes. A good example, we have a list right now, and we're trying to figure out a priority. And there's also two different, I guess, levels of sampling. One would be special studies, and another would be kind of like a core constituent. So in looking at special studies, something that could help, particularly with the regulated community from the Central Valley drinking water policy, is a pathogen study. That's what came out of the policy, and it needs to be done. So why require each individual discharger to do a separate pathogen study? It makes more sense to put it under a regional monitoring program. Now, maybe how much of a problem is that? How high does it relate in, water quality and potential beneficial use impacts? It's something that's going to have to be done. So that's a specific example.
Yeah, we've got an example of monitoring that we're currently doing within our NPDES compliance monitoring is pyrethroid insecticides.
Right.
And we identified this, probably 8 years ago as an issue in urban runoff.
Right.
And essentially we sort of stipulated, yeah, we know it's an urban runoff, let's go solve the problem. And I think you're probably aware that we were actually successful in getting the DPR to adopt the surface water protection regulations. Well, since we're doing all this pyrethroid monitoring, and it doesn't really add to any of our knowledge about, well, what's going on in the Delta. And so and I mentioned that the Region 9 was thinking, oh yeah, we've got to increase requirements and use the Clean Water Act to get these NPDES discharges to clean it up. Taking a close look at what is the contribution of pyrethroid insecticides to issues, say like POD, or there may be some other issues. What's it doing out there? Is a lot more useful piece of information than, yeah, we can still detect pyrethroids in stormwater. It's just, it's something that we already know and does nothing. So that would be one example. There are other examples of things that we've really characterized our stormwater really well. It's like stormwater everywhere else. It's, if you've got a city, you're going to have this stuff in there. So let's figure out how it's affecting the receiving water. It would be a much better use of our dollars.
That's helpful.
Actually, the steering committee has a list of 5 general groups that we were looking at. Pathogens has already been mentioned, which is Cryptosporidium and Giardia specifically. Nutrients, particularly nitrogen, and all of these things, like the nutrients, it's not just a run out and start grabbing samples. It's a look at the existing data, of which there's a lot for nutrients.
Right.
Decide if there are holes in that data or something like that that needs to be done to help the regional board move on with a nutrient numeric endpoint or something. Pesticides, pyrethroids being one example. Toxicity, which could be pesticides, it could be lots of other things, but we have toxicity issues in some parts of the Delta. And then methylmercury. Again, all of these things are issues, big issues in the Delta. Some of them may not be ripe at this time to start working on because of just where we are in terms of information, or at least there's a lot of work that needs to be done evaluating existing information. But this is basically the list we're looking at passing on to the Technical Advisory Committee, who will be working with the Regional Board and Aquatic Science Center and setting up a group of experts to help advise whether this is a project that's worth proceeding with, and what does that mean in terms of sample location, sample type, sample dollars, coordinating with other monitoring programs. We've talked to like the Department of Water Resources, municipal water monitoring people who are out there all the time. There's a lot of things they'd be willing to just take a sample bottle with them and collect a sample so we could get additional monitoring data quite cheaply compared to, setting up a whole independent. So there's a lot more than just us grabbing sample bottles and going out. It's evaluating the existing problems, who's doing what now, and trying to leverage a lot that's going on. Looking for funding sources, grants, all sorts of, ways of moving forward, again, not just on this funding neutral concept, because you're not going to go very far with funding neutral other than get something started, which is, so, okay.
Good. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you all for giving me the photo credit for slide 8.
Thank you for providing your photos as resource.
Well, yeah, you know, for my fellow board members and staff, you know, I have the privilege of going out and seeing places, just being a state board member, and I always bring my camera just out of habit. And so for all regional and state board staff on the intranet, I post my field trip photos labeled where they're located and everything, and you're welcome to use them for, you know, eye wash in your presentations. Thank you.
You can also give him some sample bottles. Other questions? Well, thank you. It's great. And thank you for taking the time to come share it with us. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot in the years ahead.
Thank you, Tam, for bringing them in.
Yeah. All right. I believe we're done. Meeting adjourned.